You know, when we think about science, we think about rules and procedures. But have you ever stopped to ask why we have those rules, especially when it comes to experimenting on people? Well, the truth is, the rulebook for research ethics wasn't just written, it was forged in the fire of some truly shocking historical experiments. So let's dive into the studies that, for better or worse, forced science to grow a conscience.
And that really brings us to the big question, the one that hangs over all of this. How far is too far in the search for knowledge? At what point does that noble pursuit of understanding the human mind cross a line and start causing real, lasting harm? Just keep that question in the back of your mind as we go through this.
Okay, so before we jump into the past, let's get a handle on the present. Right now, today, anyone who wants to conduct research with human beings has to follow an incredibly strict ethical code. And this isn't optional, it's not a guideline. It's the absolute foundation of all modern science that involves people.
And that code is really built on three core pillars. First up, consent and the right to withdraw. It means you are in control. You have to agree to participate, and you can get up and walk away at any time, for any reason, no questions asked. Second, the benefit has to outweigh the risk. You can't just conduct a reckless experiment. The potential good for society has to be way, way bigger than any possible harm to the participants. And third, and this is so important, respect and well-being. Researchers have to remember that you are a person, not just a test subject. Your well-being is the top priority, always. These are the rules of the road today. But here's the thing, it wasn't always this way, not even close. These pillars we just talked about, they were built on the rubble of some really terrible mistakes. You see, there was a time when researchers were guided by a different belief, that the end, the knowledge they were after, justified the means. And the means? Well, let's just see for ourselves. All right, our first case, it involves a 9-month-old infant, an infant known to history only as Little Albert. And the goal here was chillingly simple, to see if an emotion, specifically fear, could be conditioned, basically taught, to a human being from scratch.
So back in 1920, a researcher named John Watson was really inspired by Pavlov's famous work with dogs, ringing a bell and making them salivate. Watson started to wonder, if you can condition a dog to salivate at the sound of a bell, could you condition a human baby to feel fear on command?
And the method they used was, wow, it was just so simple and terrifyingly effective. So at first, Little Albert was totally fine with the white rat. He even seemed to like it. But then, every single time he reached for the rat, the researchers would sneak up behind him and smash a steel bar with a hammer. Just this horrible, loud, clanging noise. It did not take long for his little brain to make the connection. Soon enough, just the sight of the rat was enough to make him burst into tears. The impact was just profound, and the fear didn't stop with the rat. It spread, it generalized. Soon Albert was terrified of anything that was furry, a rabbit, a dog, even a fur coat or a Santa Claus mask. They had successfully installed a phobia in a baby. And the most tragic part? There is no record of them ever trying to undo the damage they had done. You'd think the ethical red flags from the Little Albert study would have changed things. But those questions went unanswered for decades. And in 1939, another experiment took place, this time targeting children who were even more vulnerable because they had no parents to protect them. This next one was eventually nicknamed the Monster Study. And that name didn't come from the researchers. It came from the people who were subjected to it as children. And well, that pretty much tells you everything you need to know about its legacy. So the setting was an orphanage, and the researchers found 22 children to be their subjects. The goal was to see if you could actually induce stuttering just by using psychological pressure. They took the kids, some who already had minor speech issues and some who didn't, and they split them into two groups. The first group got constant praise. They were told their speech was fine, that they were doing great. But the second group? They were just relentlessly criticized. They were told they had a stutter, that something was wrong with them. They were even told, don't ever speak unless you can do it right. I mean, just try to imagine being a little kid and hearing that every single day from an adult in authority.
And the results were absolutely devastating. Of the 6 children in that negative group who started out with perfectly normal speech, 5 of them began to stutter. For the kids who already had a slight stutter, it got much, much worse. But it goes beyond that. They suffered lifelong psychological trauma. They became anxious, self-conscious, and were afraid to speak for the rest of their lives.
Okay, let's fast forward to the 1970s. You might think, surely by then, things had improved. But one of the most famous and most controversial experiments in the history of psychology was just about to unfold. And this time, it involved young adults who actually signed up for it. This brings us to the infamous Stanford Prison Experiment, which was led by the psychologist Philip Zimbardo. So in 1971, Zimbardo recruited a bunch of male university students for what he called a 2-week prison simulation. They flipped a coin to randomly assign them to be either prisoners or guards. And the prison itself, it was just the basement of a university building they'd converted.
Zimbardo's own words really frame the whole thing perfectly. He wanted to see if a toxic environment could corrupt ordinary, good people. The guards were given a very simple instruction: maintain order, but you can't use any physical violence.
The situation went downhill with shocking speed. By day 2, just day 2, the guards were already using these cruel psychological tactics. We're talking sleep deprivation, public humiliation, really demeaning punishments. The prisoners started to have emotional breakdowns. And by day 6, the whole experiment, which was planned to last for 2 weeks, had to be shut down. It had just become way too real, and people were genuinely suffering.
So what stopped it? Well, the experiment was ultimately halted when another researcher, Christina Maslach, who was also Zimbardo's girlfriend at the time, visited the prison. She was horrified by what was happening, and she confronted Zimbardo directly with these words. She reminded him of his ethical responsibility for the very real harm he was causing. So, after looking at these 3 cases, Little Albert, the Monster Study, and the Stanford Prison Experiment, the big question is, why? Why would none of these experiments ever be allowed to happen today? Well, it's because they all share the same fundamental ethical failures. They all inflicted severe psychological distress. The participants, especially the kids, couldn't give real consent, and they certainly couldn't just walk away. And in the end, they caused harm that, for some, lasted an entire lifetime. They basically violated every single one of those 3 pillars we talked about at the very beginning.
And this, right here, is the most important takeaway from all of this. As horrifying as these stories are, they served as a crucial, desperately needed wake-up call for the scientific community. They are the reason we have review boards and strict ethical codes today. The suffering of those participants, it directly led to the protections that every single person in a research study has today. Their harm, in a way, became our shield.
Which brings us right back to that question from the start. You see, these researchers believed they were pursuing important knowledge, but the human cost was just immense. It leaves us with this permanent dilemma that follows all scientific inquiry. How do we keep pushing the boundaries of what we know while making absolutely sure we never, ever repeat the mistakes of the past?